Hello, everyone. In this session, we're going to trace the diagnostic journey of a bacterial infection. Now, this is a path that starts right at the patient's bedside and ends with us identifying the exact culprit. Understanding this entire process isn't just for exams, it's absolutely essential for smart patient management, for good antimicrobial stewardship, and for protecting public health. So let's get started.
All right, here's our roadmap. We're going to follow the logical flow of a real diagnostic workup. We'll kick things off with the why, the foundational principles. Then we'll dive into the pre-analytical phase, which is honestly where most errors happen. From there, we'll look at microscopy, explore some rapid detection methods, and finally, we'll cover the classic cornerstone of bacteriology, culture.
Okay, let's lay the groundwork. It's so important to remember that every single test we order, every result we interpret, has a direct and sometimes profound impact on our patients. This is all about making the right call at the right time with solid, actionable data from the lab. And that really brings us to a key question. What is the lab's role in all of this? I want you to think of the microbiology lab not just as a place that runs tests, but as an active partner in patient care. We are a crucial part of the clinical team, helping to guide therapy and even shape public health policy.
So what does that look like in practice? Well, at its very core, of course, we identify the pathogen. This lets us switch from a broad, best guess antibiotic to a narrow, targeted one. But it goes way beyond just one patient. We're also doing surveillance to spot resistance trends. We investigate outbreaks in the hospital. We inform decisions on post-exposure prophylaxis, think meningococcal meningitis contacts. And we help put infection control measures in place to keep everyone safe.
Now, let's move on to the pre-analytical phase. And let me be clear, this is, without a doubt, the most critical part of the entire process. A mistake made here, at the point of collection, can't be fixed. No matter how fancy our lab equipment is, a bad sample will always give you a bad result. This statement right here, this is the central dogma of clinical microbiology. It's a mantra. It really highlights the huge responsibility that falls on the clinician collecting the sample. The quality of the information we can give back to you depends entirely on the quality of the specimen you give to us.
So, choosing the right specimen is step number one. Let's make this practical. You have a patient you suspect has sepsis. What do you need? Paired blood cultures from 2 different sites. Suspected meningitis, it's got to be cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. A patient with a deep, productive cough, you're looking for sputum or a BAL. And for a simple UTI, a clean catch midstream urine is the standard. Getting this right from the start is absolutely fundamental.
And following these rules is just non-negotiable. First, you have to collect specimens before starting antibiotics. Why? Because even one dose can kill off the bacteria we're trying to grow, leading to a false negative. Aseptic technique is everything. And here's a clinical pearl for you. Whenever you have the choice, aspirates and tissues are way better than swabs. A swab just scrapes the surface, but an aspirate or a piece of tissue gets you to the real site of the infection, bypassing all those surface contaminants.
Let's zero in on blood cultures because contamination here is a massive problem. It leads to misdiagnosis and unnecessary antibiotic use. You have to use a diligent 2-step technique. First, you hit the skin with alcohol. That gets rid of oils and surface dirt. You let it dry. Then, you follow up with an antiseptic, like chlorhexidine, to kill the bacteria living on the skin. This simple 2-step process dramatically reduces the risk of us misinterpreting a skin bug as a true bloodstream pathogen.
Okay, you've collected a perfect specimen. Now what? Well, the clock is ticking. For absolutely critical samples like CSF, transport to the lab has to be immediate. We're talking less than 15 minutes. That's because some bugs like Neisseria meningitidis are incredibly fragile and will just die off if they sit around, totally compromising the diagnosis. For most other samples, the rule of thumb is under 2 hours. All right, our top quality specimen has safely arrived in the lab. The first thing we often do is take a look under the microscope. This gives us our very first glimpse of the potential enemy, providing incredibly rapid, actionable information that can help guide therapy hours or even days before the culture results are ready. The absolute workhorse of bacteriology is the Gram stain. And it all starts with the primary stain, crystal violet. At this first stage, it's pretty simple. We flood the slide, and every single bacterial cell on there, it doesn't matter what kind it is, soaks up this deep purple dye. Next up, we add Gram's iodine. Now, iodine acts as a mordant, which is just a fancy word for something that helps fix the dye. It gets inside the cells and combines with the crystal violet to form this big, bulky complex that can't be easily washed out.
and this complex gets physically tangled up in the thick cell wall of gram-causative bacteria. Now for the magic. This is the most important, most time-sensitive step, decolorization. We use an alcohol-acetone mix. In gram-positive cells, this dehydrates their thick peptidoglycan wall, shrinking the pores and trapping that big purple dye complex inside. But in gram-negative cells, the solvent just dissolves their outer membrane and easily washes the dye right out of their thin cell wall, leaving them completely colorless.
So to finish up, we apply a counterstain, usually safranin, which is pink. The gram-positive cells, they're already stuffed with purple dye, so nothing changes for them. But those colorless gram-negative cells eagerly take up the pink stain, which makes them visible again. And voila, here's the final result. We can now tell apart bacteria based on a fundamental difference in their cell walls. On the left, you see purple gram-positive cocci, and they're in clusters, which immediately makes me think of Staphylococcus. On the right, we've got pink gram-negative rods. This information, the shape and the gram reaction, gets phoned to the clinician right away, and it's already helping them choose a better empiric antibiotic. Now, the gram stain is great, but it doesn't work for everything. For some organisms, like mycobacteria, we need a different tool. These bacteria have a unique, waxy cell wall full of something called mycolic acid. The gram stain just can't penetrate it, so we use the acid-fast stain. After we stain them, these bacteria resist being decolorized by acid, and they show up as these classic slender red bacilli against a blue background. This is a hallmark finding for diagnosing tuberculosis.
Staining gives us a great first look, but sometimes we need a more specific answer, and we need it fast. That's where rapid direct detection methods come in, giving us answers straight from the patient's sample. You can really think of these in two main buckets. First, there's antigen detection. This is where we use lab-made antibodies as tiny probes to find specific pieces of a bacterium. A great example is using latex agglutination to find pneumococcal antigens in CSF for a rapid meningitis diagnosis. The other bucket is molecular diagnosis, like PCR. Here we're not looking for proteins, we're looking for the bacteria's actual DNA or RNA. These tests are unbelievably sensitive and have been a total game changer for diagnosing bugs that are super hard to grow in the lab. And that brings us to the gold standard of diagnostic bacteriology, culture. This is the art and science of actually growing the bacteria in the lab. The whole point is to get a pure, isolated colony of the bad guy. Why? Because we need that live organism for a definitive ID, and most importantly for the patient, to see which antibiotics will actually kill it.
So to grow bacteria, we basically have to cook for them. We use something called culture media. Think of it as a nutrient-packed soup or jello designed to give bacteria everything they need to multiply. It has a carbon source, a nitrogen source like peptone, minerals, and sometimes special growth factors from things like blood or meat extracts. And we use agar to turn it into a solid surface so we can see individual colonies grow.
We have a whole pantry of different media, each with a specific job. Blood agar is our enriched, all-purpose plate. Most things will grow on it, and it's also differential, because we can see how the bacteria break down the blood cells. McConkey agar is both selective and differential. Its bile salts stop gram-positives from growing, and it differentiates gram-negatives based on whether they can ferment lactose, turning the colony pink. Chocolate agar is even more enriched for super picky organisms like Haemophilus. And then there are highly selective media, like LJ medium, specifically designed for slow growers like Mycobacterium tuberculosis.
So, to wrap it all up, this entire diagnostic process is really an interconnected chain. Every single link, from proper collection to timely transport to choosing the right media in the lab, is a critical part of patient care. If even one of those links breaks, the whole chain can fall apart and we might miss the diagnosis. Attention to detail at every step is absolutely everything. And this brings us to a final thought, a question to leave you with. As these incredibly fast and sensitive molecular tests become more and more common, what does that mean for the future of our old friends, microscopy and culture? Will they become obsolete? I don't think so, but their roles are certainly evolving. While the new tech gives us speed, there's still no substitute for having a live organism on a plate to test against a full panel of antibiotics. It's a dynamic balance we'll all need to navigate as we shape the future of our field.